I wish to thank the organizers to begin with, and in particular Tom Harrison and Maddalena Scarperi and Jay Haywood for their flattering invitation for me to join this lively community. And I am most honored and happy to do so. Although, of course, happy may not be an appropriate word of state of mind in any scholarly community nowadays, worldwide, when we think of our friends and colleagues in Ukraine. And as I think of my friends and collaborators in Kiev, in Odessa, and other places, living in fear and hiding, but also in heroic defiance. I must admit that I, for one, never thought I would use such words to begin a scholarly paper in my lifetime, but here it is. To the point. I must warn you beforehand that what I will be presenting today is very much a work in progress, not just formally work in progress, and it still needs a lot to be even provisionally ready. Yet another consequence of this is that I will need to refer you, for which I apologize beforehand, to my forthcoming work on the subject mentioned in my bibliography. Wait a moment. As I will start with Herodotus to turn to other authors throughout the archaic and classical period, some of them, of course, I feel I have to tell you one more thing. Essentially, my paper is intended to show you or to show us and myself as well, just why, while giving us rare glimpses into Greek political patronage, Herodotus does not show us more of it. And the same is true of other Greek writers I will be referring to. Almost 20 years ago, in his extremely stimulating paper on democracy without theory, John Davis observed that the informal networks of influence and social control, in other words, Greek and especially Athenian patronage, broadly conceived, only recently begun to attract the attention it deserves, end quote. Since then, much has been done, of course, in particular, I think in two interconnected realms, which are directly opposite to my paper today. In both, one scholar should be mentioned right away, namely Hans van Wees, whose work on archaic and early classical Greek warfare, on the one hand, and on archaic society and political life, on the other, is of paramount importance to me, especially in his studies on racketeers and patrons, and in general on mafia-style regime in archaic Greece. Although I think I myself would not put it in such a radical way. In my present context, other scholars have recently contributed to both these fields of study as well. Let me only mention Miriam Valdez-Guilla and her most recent work on elites and military power in archaic Athens. You find all this in my bibliography. In 2003, when John Davis formulated his scholarly desideratum, the available data for the archaic and early classical patronage had preliminarily been gathered by Paul Millett. But later on Athenian democracy, and it was Athenian democracy and Athenian law courts of law that attracted particular attention. And again, in my bibliography, one of the papers by Andrew Allwine and Rachel Zelnik-Abramowitz, for instance. But in all this, the ultimate conclusion proved rather disappointing, and the actual data extremely scanty. In his remarkable book of 2017, classical Greek oligarchy, Matthew Simonton distinguished between oligarchic clientelism as a hypothetical model not supported straightforwardly by historical sources for oligarchic regimes, on the one hand, and patronage on the other, in that the former is a political strategy instituted by an authoritarian government to ensure its rule. And this is what, of course, transcends ancient history and reaches as far as our times with some deplorable consequences for what we are living now. The locus classicus for Greek patronage is the much discussed passage of Theopompus. The anecdote is also referred to in Plutarch's Life of Kimon that I present you here in my presentation, regarding Kimon's magnanimity towards his fellow Demotai and most probably Athenian citizens at large, but also his constant attendance by a retinue of young Athenians. I will read it, of course you have it, but just to have it in our ears as well. And since he was already wealthy, Kimon lavished the revenues from his campaign, which he was thought to have won with honor from the enemy, to his still greater honor on his fellow citizens. He took away the fences from his fields and so on. And every day he gave a dinner at his house, simple, it is true, but sufficient for many, to which any poor man who wished came in. But Aristotle says that it was not for all Athenians, but only for his demesmen. He was constantly attended by young comrades in fine attire, each of whom, whenever an elderly citizen in needy array came up, was ready to exchange raiment with him. The practice made a deep impression. This is a much discussed passage, and I would like to start my paper with it. But as far as I can see, one crucial passage, albeit not infrequently commented on by scholars, has been neglected in our present context, that of ancient Greek patronage. In Book 8 of Herodotus, one reads that during the Battle of Artemisium, on the Greek side, battle honors went that day to the Athenians, among them to Cleinias, the son of Alcibiades the elder, so to say, who provided 200 men and his own ship, all at his expense, for the war effort. In Herodotus 5:47:1, Philippus of Croton, Olympic winner of 520 or 16, the son of Butacides, joins the faithful expedition of Dorieus of Sparta in the last decade of the 6th century BC, with his own trireme and his own men, all paid at his expense. In both cases, the way Herodotus narrates these episodes does not suggest one-off exploits, but rather ships traditionally owned and equipped by a particularly wealthy family. Ships that naturally needed to be manned on a regular basis to be of any use. The passage concerning Cleinias, the son of Alcibiades at Artemisium, has been discussed as a piece of information on, quote, this is Angus Bowie's commentary on this passage, private financing of ships that was later formalized by the liturgy system in Athens. And indeed, when combined with the case of Philippus of Croton, it most probably testifies to the practice predating Cleisthenes and post-Cleisthenean military forms in Athens. To me, however, the most salient feature of this account is the mere presence of 200 decently trained men who all seem to be Athenian citizens and in one way or another may be considered a group of Cleinias's followers. If we assume such an interpretation of this passage, we obtain a vital testimony of the existence of significant military, but in peacetime, most probably also political, support groups which could be mastered by prominent Athenians. The well-known Plutarch's account, I don't have it in my handouts, about as many as 100 of the hetairoi of Kimon killed in the Battle of Tanagra in 557, although most probably historically unreliable, certainly follows an earlier tradition regarding Kimon and his supporters and followers. In this case, it is worthwhile to observe that his hetairoi here do not belong to his own phyle or his own deme. So the idea is that a considerable number of citizens from all over Attica might have been loyal to this politician, loyal to death. If I'm not mistaken, the private, so to say, dimension of the Persian Wars and early classical wars in general is still an understudied subject. But my purpose today is more general. Sorry, I will be back to my bibliography now. In his paper of 1999, Hans van Wees, the paper entitled "The Mafia of Early Greece, Violent Exploitation in the 7th and 6th centuries BC," Hans van Wees offers a brilliant, and to my mind, undoubtedly correct, reinterpretation of the famous formula of Hesiod's works and days, namely Dorophagoi Basilees, or gift-devouring princes. He does not interpret it as referring to bribery and corruption of local Boeotian elites, as it has been universally interpreted thus far, but takes it as a sign of the practice of, quote, extortion of a range of gifts in exchange for largely notional protection against one's enemies in battle or in court, unquote. Besides a few well-known lines from Homer, Van Wees's evidence here is largely comparative and based on Sicilian mafia practices. But I think we can find relevant data in our Greek sources as well. In Book 8 of Athenaios, one reads that Aristotle, in his Constitution of Naxian, writes as follows about the proverb, "No, many rich Naxians lived in the city, while the rest were scattered about in villages. In one village known as Leistiadae lived Telestagoras, who was extremely wealthy and well respected, and whom people honored in many ways, including by sending him gifts every day. And whenever people went down to the harbor from the city and tried to drive down the price of some merchandise, the vendors routinely said that they would rather give it to Telestagoras than sell it for so little. Some young men were trying to buy a large fish. When the fishermen said the usual thing, they became annoyed and hearing this again and again, and got drunk and went in a group, in a komos, to visit him. Although Telestagoras welcomed them amiably, the young men beat him up and abused Hybrisan, his two marriageable daughters. The Naxians were appalled at this behavior and seized their weapons and attacked the young men. The result was a major civic crisis in which Lygdamis served as the Naxian leader. He emerged from his command as tyrant of his native land. The actual circumstances of Lygdamis's rise to power are not crucial to me, not important. What is important is to interpret the starting point, or better, the trigger mechanism of the social and political crisis in Naxos. First of all, the Naxian elites, called euporoi, and clearly contrasted with the demos, live both in the city and in the countryside. Among these elites, there is another and presumably much smaller group, represented by Telestagoras in this account, outstanding for its wealth and respect they command. It is them, as Telestagoras here, important, not the basis The logic of this account and the nature of the vendor's bitter joke involved strongly suggests that such gifts are rather symbolic, perhaps quite random, and not too formalized. Incidentally, one is reminded here of the famous episode of Polycrates' ring in Herodotus, where a fisherman caught a huge, beautiful fish and decided to present it to Polycrates because it seemed to him to be worthy of the tyrant. And in Athenaeus, one reads of a sympathetic incident involving a group of hubristic youth attacking Telestagoras's house and his family by the end of a particularly agitated komos, or drunken revelry. Telestagoras' amiable welcome, presumably late in the night, is clearly another sign of the former sympathetic circumstances of these events. In other words, a brutal intra-elite incident spiraled into a full-fledged civil conflict, or stasis, due to the involvement of the majority of the citizens of Naxos, or the demos appalled at this behavior. Tyranny is presented as a natural outcome of this escalating discord, when a prominent individual assumes the role of the leader or prostates of the demos. Was the fight based on the clash between followers of different powerful individuals of Naxos? This seems possible. Now, commenting on Hesiod's gift-devouring princes, in line with some more general models regarding archaic Greek economy, Hans van Wees claims that first, neither Solon nor Theognis ever complains that the upper class eats gifts. The exploitation of gift giving was evidently no longer a major issue by the end of the 7th century. A probable reason for the change is that gifts given to private patrons became gradually less significant, contributed to public funds, which in turn developed into regular payment of taxes. Now, since Legdames' tyrannies usually dated to the late 40s of the 6th century BC, the Naxian gift-giving practice brings us as late as, say, mid-6th century. And I think it is fair to combine this practice with the cases of private warfare before and during the Persian Wars, mobilizing up to 200 men I mentioned earlier. Nevertheless, Van Wees's remarks seem generally valid. But facing these late testimonies of what I would take as archaic and early classical Greek political patronage, post-dating Solon and Theognis, we need to abandon, I think, generalizing and evolutionary historical models and look instead for other explanations of the highly inconspicuous, but at the same time matter-of-fact, presence of such practices in our historical record. In the present state of preservation of early Greek prose, Herodotus should be our best witness to the matter, or rather, he might a priori be expected to provide us with abundant examples of Greek political patronage. But this is not the case. Instead, as we have seen, he only offers rare and occasional glimpses into this socio-political phenomenon. How should we explain this silence? I believe we are facing here one of the most intriguing problems of archaic and early classical Greek history. And the key to a tentative answer to this question is to consider the nature of archaic and early classical Greek elites, the strangely unobtrusive patrons in this social relationship. As you all know, we witness lively ongoing debates with an ever-growing number of scholars questioning the very existence of the archaic classical Greek aristocracy as a social group. Instead, a new concept has emerged, a behavioral definition, interestingly emphasizing various strategies of social recognition of prominent and duly successful individuals and their families. The wonderful work by Alain Dupuis, which I mentioned in my bibliography as a starting point of this development. In this manner, the famous opposition between the aristoi or agathoi, the good ones on the one hand, and the kakoi or deiloi, the vile ones on the other, ubiquitously present in our literary sources, is being questioned as a historical reality. For want of time, I would argue that our main problem here is the definitions we use, or better, the expectations we have towards the hypothetical Greek aristocracy. Thus, based on comparative analogies, Nick Fisher and Hans van Wees, again in my bibliography of 2015, persuasively argue that, quote, the political and economic preconditions for the creation of hereditary aristocracies of the medieval and early modern type, that is, strong royal authority, stable transmission of wealth, did not exist in most parts of the ancient world. And we have much less evidence that we used to imagine, for the importance of hereditary status and privilege in general, and for the existence of closed hereditary elites in particular, unquote. However, instead of measuring the Greek aristoi against social elites of other historical periods, I would suggest just looking for another definition of Greek aristocracy. All the more so that the comparative data involved, the aforementioned medieval and early modern European type, was far from being universal, even in Europe, and did not apply at all, for instance, to Eastern European socioeconomic and political realities, such as those dominating in what is today Belarusia, Lithuania, Poland, or Ukraine. Not at all. In my book of 2014, The Rise of the Greek Aristocratic Banquet, and a series of my forthcoming papers, and with an international group of young scholars from a research project of Poland's National Science Center, I have tried to do so abandoning the requirements as hereditary status and privilege, and more generally, the status of hereditary elites. Here, Herodotus, our fundamental narrative source for archaic and early classical Greek history, comes to our rescue once again. The way elites feature in Herodotus seems telling indeed. Very rarely, we are told more specifically of what it takes to be counted as such, as in the case of Miltiades the Elder, in Athens, in Herodotus Book 6, who is explicitly said to belong to a four-horse family, that is a family successful in economically demanding racing competitions, and to stem from a family with heroic ancestors, Iacchos, in the event. But he is only characterized in this way, a very rare case in Herodotus in general, because Herodotus' reader needs to understand that and why he was still powerful at the Nastawer in Athens, ruled by the tyrant Pisistratus. This is the only reason why we learn about his status in some more detail. Logically, in the majority of cases in Herodotus, we only hear that an individual was notable or powerful, dokimos, dokimotatos, logimos, or had kratos in his own community. In the famous episode of the wedding of Agaristi, remarkably interpreted by Tom Harrison earlier in this series of seminars, we learn some more. When mentioning the suitors of the tyrant's daughter, in general, which is crucially important here, too young to earn their own elevated social position, Herodotus uses what I would call a default characterization of their nobility by referring to the qualities of their fathers or older brothers, such as lavish lifestyle, family riches, good looks, wisdom, athletic victories, exceptional physical strength, family connections to powerful tyrants, and even personal familiarity with gods. When we look for a common denominator of all this, the only valid criterion seems to be some sort of celebrity achieved by one's kin or close ancestor within and or beyond one's local community. In a word, we are dealing with individual and family outstanding success, most often in Herodotus, yielded by a technical term he uses for Greek elites the most often, namely paches, the wealthy ones, or literally the fat ones. What is more, in many cases, they are directly opposed, and sometimes they fight with the as in the cases I'm just showing you in my presentation. Most strikingly, cities are overwhelmed by Gelon, the paches of Megara Hyblaya, once again, here, and of the Euboeans of Sicily are given citizenship of his capital Syracuse, whereas the demos of all those communities is simply sold into slavery. There is no point in denying, I believe, that at any given time, both fellow citizens and outsiders were perfectly capable of defining the aristocrats of any given community. In other words, archaic aristocracy, Greek aristocracy as a group, is a historical reality. It is what we see in Herodotus, a self-referring, self-referential way of dealing with such a social group. In my work on the Symposium and archaic and early classical Greek aristocracy, I have tried to show that the Symposium was a hub or focal point of the mechanisms of natural selection of the Greek aristocracy. What I meant was that the ambitious non-aristocrats striving for social advancement beyond requisite economic success, allowing them to be admitted to the ranks of the local elite, had to learn, alongside their male offspring, some elements of the aristocratic culture, and in particular, some sympathetic poetry. Once ready to join in the social elite of their communities, in economic terms, they would need at least some rudimentary cultural competences to be admitted. In other words, investing in families' cultural capital, in the banquetal skills and sympathetic poetry in the event was a necessary prerequisite of future social advancement. So in principles, all the ambition kakoi of the highly competitive Greek communities should gravitate to a more conspicuous intimacy with aristocratic culture. Nowadays, and not in the least based on the episode of the wedding of Agariste, where the andragatie of the suitors is checked against their banquetal skills and their athletic skills as well, I would add to this cultural capital one more platform of inclusion of the ambitious kakoi to the ranks of aristocracy. That means yet another outstanding social practice marked by a highest degree of competition among equals and requiring a set of otherwise highly symbolic skills, sometimes in practical, in real life terms, namely athletics. For want of time, I cannot develop this here today, and I'm very sorry for that. Now, the characterization of, here it is, of Greek aristocracy I just proposed gives us the opportunity to reassess the inherent weakness of Greek political patronage, as testified to by its highly inconspicuous presence in our historical record, from Homer to Herodotus and beyond. To conclude then, let me ponder for a while, however preliminarily, on the difference between the Roman and Greek patronage and its ultimate consequence in the Roman case, namely the deep political and social tensions, nay, occasional social and political revolutions, at least partly due to the sharp division between the Roman patrons and the Roman clients as social groups, that is, between the Roman patricians and the Roman plebeians across the history of the Roman Republic. For want of time, I must be very brief here, and I apologize for that. I hope to be able to develop it in the future. Now, the relatively open nature of archaic and early classical Greek aristocracies, and in particular the aristocratic culture I referred to a moment ago, turned the Greek nobles into what may be called aspirational elites. Hence, the fundamental phenomenon of vertical social mobility to join in the ranks of the aristoi, amply testified to from Homer to Herodotus, as I tried to show in a forthcoming paper on early Greek poetry, social mobility, and Solon's reforms. And one endemic problem of archaic Greek social and political history was the existence of a group of successful kakoi, the commoners, who were not successful enough and therefore who were not recognized as good enough to be called aristoi in their local communities. Hence, the intriguing political and intellectual attempts at stalling or freezing social mobility of the less successful kakoi, as for instance, when Hesiod in his Works and Days suggests that people who did not achieve a certain level of wealth should abstain from being involved in politics, from going to the agora. But also, in this very way, in line with this interpretation, I will interpret one of the aspects of the Solon's idea to introduce census classes in Athens. Be it as it may, there were flexible mechanisms of social advancement, sealed by mostly cultural competences or cultural capital, once the economic threshold passed to be able to live the aristocratic, that is, duly leisurely lifestyle. What is crucially important here, I would argue, is the largely individual nature of the mechanisms of social advancement. Up to a certain point, as until the reforms of Solon, for instance, in Athens, old local elites decided on the admission of individual successful kakoi and their progeny into their ranks. It is only afterwards that there were special, publicly observed divisions and classifications based on more or less objective criteria to be included in this or that group within the civic body. It may be assumed that they usually tended to be rather liberal in this respect, as long as individual success, clearly testifying to one's divine support and protection, was universally recognized. As such, these mechanisms did not foster the need to group organization or even self-defense of the kakoi as a group, as it was the case for the Roman plebeians. To put it in a general way, on the one hand, the efficient paths of individual social advancement decisively weakens the subversive potential of underprivileged social groups in archaic Greek political communities. But on the other hand, the ideological duality between the aristoi and the kakoi so important for Theognis to stigmatize the rise of unworthy arrivists was never clear, strong, and permanent enough for the members of the latter group, or perhaps only the ambitious members of the demos, to seek the long-term protection and endorsement and promotion by the most powerful agathoi, of course, depending on local, social, political, and economic circumstances, as we have seen. This was always possible, as in the case of Naxos or Athens or Croton. And we do have enough examples of archaic and early classical Greek political patronage. But owing to the nature of early Greek aristocracy, and in particular to the workings of aristocratic culture, this was never a decisive factor in early Greek history. Therefore, Herodotus was, of course, right not to attach too much importance to this relatively rare socio-political phenomenon, is interesting though it would be for us, his 21st century devoted readers. Thank you very much for your patience.